Randall has been a pastor, and it's great to have you here.
All right. Thanks, Joe. For a minute, I thought Joe said Randall's a has-been pastor. Morning. It is great to be here, and thanks for having me. Just a little bit about me. I've lived in Gillette almost 11 years now. I moved here with my family in 2007 to be the store manager at Walmart. If you need a little more than just a calendar reference, that was just after the store transitioned to being a super center and opened up as a big Walmart with the grocery side and all that other stuff. I guess I want to point that out because if you're still kind of cranky about how that process went, don't blame me. I came after. I finished up about an 18-and-a-half-year career as the store manager here. I did it for a little over 6 years, and then decided to follow a call to ministry. And I went and worked at New Life Church, where I was the family pastor. And as a family pastor, youth was one of my responsibilities. Many of our discipleship efforts, so classes we did both on Sunday mornings and midweek. At that time, sort of how we did some of our small groups of the church, those all fell under my responsibility. Did a little bit of counseling, a little bit of that kind of thing. And then after a few years, really started to feel a tug. Absolutely nothing wrong at New Life. Definitely nothing weird happened. Sometimes when we hear about someone no longer in the ministry, we wonder, did something inappropriate happen? Was there money missing from the offering plate or anything like that? No, not at all. Not at all. I just actually went back to what was an original plan, a first love of mine, and that was to teach. And so I now teach 6th grade with a focus mostly on math and science at Wagon Wheel Elementary School. While I was at New Life is where I got to meet Donovan, a little bit because he and Robin were attending there. His kids, Michael and Jack, were in the youth group there. But more so through a third friend. And we get together on Wednesdays, Donovan, myself, and a couple of the guys. And we did some book studies, and we spent some time just kind of visiting, encouraging one another. And Donovan and I kind of hit it off right away. We had many, many things in common, as he at the time was a former pastor. He was an educator. His oldest, Eli, and my oldest, Jacob, were getting ready to graduate. So we talk about kind of the tension of that, to see your first child graduate and go on and do other things. Now our second kids are also graduating. Michael and my second son Samuel are also close to graduation. So now when we get together, we invariably talk about those things a lot. And then when the time came to move on from New Life, and it had nothing to do with I didn't love it there or anything like that. I tried a couple different other churches in town, but eventually found myself here. And Donovan never pressed the issue. He never forced it or kept inviting me or anything like that. But as soon as I walked in, I felt a certain level of comfort, and I'll kind of talk about that a little bit more later. Which pretty much gets us up to a few weeks ago when Donovan texted me and said, "Hey, we're going to be in Annapolis April 15th. Would you like to teach?" And I said, "Well, that's quite a jump because usually sit in the very last row. I like to come in about 9:59. I like to slip out as soon as possible, all the way up to the pulpit." And he said, in typical Donovan humor, "That sounds like a great title, back row to the pulpit. Why don't you preach on that?" I'm not, by the way, but I'm going to keep it in my back pocket for later on. And then I got a little nervous, because if you spent any time with Donovan, it's kind of intimidating to be Donovan's friend. He's probably a better athlete than you. He probably is a better dresser than you. I came here and realized he's a better speaker than me. Last week, I listened to him play piano and sing, and I'm like, that's not even close. And I think he might have better jokes than me. But I'm going to try. So I pulled some of these up. We'll see. Why did the waiter put rubber bands in the soup? Because he wasn't a very good waiter. Let's see, that's a little bit what I was afraid of. What's a pirate's favorite letter of the alphabet? That's what I thought too, but actually none. Most historians believe that pirates were illiterate, so they wouldn't. Okay. And hey, the 80s called, and they're really excited about inventing a phone that can call the future. And see, and that's exactly what I was afraid of. that his jokes are unequivocally better than mine. So I like that last one, though, because I grew up as an 80s kid. My elementary through middle school years were right in that sweet spot of the 80s. I grew up in southeastern Iowa, and I attended a Baptist church that on the surface looks a lot like this one. The interior looks a lot alike, the exterior very similar music we would sing. I feel this weird sense of nostalgia and comfort holding a hymnal. I haven't done that for many years, but it takes me back to those days. No one sat in the first 3 rows there either. And I really, really did love that community that I was a part of even as a child, and have many, many good memories of that. But I also didn't always necessarily love the teaching, and I'll explain that in a minute. Some of you remember, some of you don't. The 80s were actually a great time for music. It was a great time for fashion. Lots of good things going on in our country, but it was also kind of a scary time. If you were an 80s kid, you spent a lot of time afraid. We were at the height and maybe some ways the worst part of the Cold War. I remember spending most of my middle school years convinced that we were going to be nuked at any given time. There was a rabid fear around our country, and our parents believed that their kids were going to be taken at any time, and the whole child on a milk carton phenomenon was going on then. And so if that wasn't going to happen to me, if there wasn't going to be some kind of nuclear war, then there's a really good chance I was going to be kidnapped. And then unfortunately, I grew up in a church that was all too often popular at that time, all too often prevalent at that time, and they added in some more stuff. And our church then was known maybe more for what it was against than what it was for. We were vehemently against things like MTV and heavy metal, Halloween, school dances, lots and lots of movie studio and TV studio boycotts. And add that to the other things, and I just spent a lot of time nervous about that. I remember being about 7th grade and just really, really wishing and praying with all my heart that people would just stop listening to hard rock and roll, because that's what I was being told every Sunday was hurting us and was leading us almost literally straight to hell. There was, and I have to qualify, I have to stop right here. I'm not making fun of these things. Just for me, there was a lot of tension and a lot of fear that came out of them. There was this satanic panic that gripped our country and gripped the church I attended. I remember one night telling my youth group leader that my friends and I had spent the night outside in the tent out back, and we had so much fun, and we'd actually snuck out in the middle of the night and played in the yard and stuff like that. And he said, "Don't you dare ever do that again. Don't you know right over the hill there's this creek, and many, many satanic cults meet there, and they'll come get you." And I thought, wow. And I never stayed outside in a tent in the backyard again. There was almost always a good chick tract laying around. If you don't know what a chick tract is, go home and look it up. And there was very much a rapture culture. The movies Thief in the Night, which now I look back on them and they're not good movies, but that was Sunday night viewing at the church I was at. And so as a 9-year-old watching these horribly scary images of what it would be. And I remember many, many times Mom saying, "I'll be home from the grocery store at 3 o'clock, and then 3:15 came. I was certain that she had been raptured and I'd been left behind. And we laugh now because it's comfortable to laugh, but it still kind of makes my stomach hurt when I think about that. And what all that did for me, and I can really only speak to me. It's entirely possible somehow you out there are saying, "Yeah, those were the good old days," and that's great for you, but for me, it created a relationship with God that was solely based on fear and not being good enough. And so I prayed that sinner's prayer, asking Jesus to come into my heart dozens of times. Because the first time I did it at 8 years old, I wasn't sure it worked. So I did it again and again and again. And it started this cycle of just not being good enough. And to the point of, I began to equate when things were going good, things must be good with God, so he and I didn't talk much. And the second they started to go bad, and again, starting at 8 years old, if you can imagine that, then he and I have a long conversation with lots of promises from me that I'll say the prayer right this time, and I promise I'll be good, and I promise we'll talk more often, and I promise. And then things would start to look good again, and I'd be like, okay, I'm back in his good graces. I must have somehow done the right things. And this is a cycle that continued on in my life until probably my mid-30s. I'm not going to get into it today. It's maybe a sermon or a talk for another day, what happened then, if you are tricked into inviting me back. But a major life event happened that made me re-look at that whole thing. Look at that constant cycle of that relationship is based on fear, and it's based on God's disappointment, and it's based on not being good enough to do something and ending up somewhere I don't want to be. And look at it from a completely different point of view. Look at that relationship completely different. And we're finally going to get to that a little bit today, what it became. But part of that growth for me came from looking at the Bible in a new way. Looking in the Bible with context of what was going on then. Context is so terribly important. We have to have context if we're ever going to fully understand anything. So we'll do a little exercise here. I am going to read something that I think will mean something to everyone in the room. As soon as you recognize it, raise your hand. And I have a feeling we won't have to get very far. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We've come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who gave their lives that the nation might live. It's altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. And I'll stop there. And we don't always do this in Baptist church, but I'm giving you permission to talk. What did I just read? Gettysburg Address, right. It has incredible context to us. It has incredible meaning to us. It's part of our history. As soon as we hear those first few words, we know instantly what's going on, and pictures come to our minds. Pictures come to our minds of a battle 4.5 months before that speech was given, where over the course of just 3 days, 72 hours, 57,000 men were killed or hurt. 7,800 killed alone in 3 days. That's hundreds of men just per hour. Now, just a few years ago, I went to Haiti and met some wonderful Haitians there. Very, very intelligent people. But if I read those words to them, no pictures would come to their mind. No images would come to their mind. No feelings of patriotism or sadness or recognizing what that means to our culture would come to their mind. It's not because they're not smart people. It's not because they don't care. It's not because they're not interested. It's because it's not their history. It's not their culture. They don't have the context that makes it important. And so I learned to look at the Bible almost in a similar sense, to look at it with context, to understand the culture of that time, because I am thoroughly convinced if I were to say, is the Bible inerrant, many of you would say yes. And if I would say, is the Bible infallible, many more of you would say yes. And if I were to say, is the Bible God-breathed and Spirit-inspired, most all of you would say yes. But there's no denying that it was written by people thousands of years ago to an immediate audience that was thousands of years ago. It was, in the Old Testament's case, it was written to first century Jews, to other first century Jews. Well, I'm a 21st century American. And so I think I owe it to go back and understand what was going on at the world that time, what was important at the world that time, and what did it mean. And I think I'm finally getting there. I finally got the setup to go. So today we'll be looking at the 5th chapter of Matthew, be sort of referring to verse 3, and then in a couple minutes here we'll really be looking deeper into verse 13. So if you have a moment to flip to that, great. If not, just listen along. So what we see here is the greatest sermon of all time. Not what you're seeing right now, but what we see in the Bible is the greatest sermon of all time. It's the longest sermon the Bible records of Jesus's, and it's one of his very early sermons. It's the Sermon on the Mount. Happened soon after he was baptized by John the Baptist. and he had already spent quite a bit of time, the Bible tells us, in Galilee, traveling around. And one day this huge crowd started to gather, so Jesus went up on a hill. He went up on a mountain, hence Sermon on the Mount. And he began to give this sermon. Some have said his first public sermon. I'm not sure we can say for sure it's his first public sermon, but we can say for certain it was his biggest sermon to date. And it definitely kicked off his ministry from being in a small kind of localized ministry to that entire region of Israel. It really kicked up Jesus' influence to the people of that area to another level. And it was a huge crowd, huge crowd. Again, that's why he goes up on the mountain, so he can be seen and he can be heard. And so you can imagine being some of his closest followers in there and definitely seeing this crowd of people and seeing that Jesus is ready to talk to them. And you're probably excited and you're thinking, man, he is really going to lay some good teaching on us right now. And this is what they got. Blessed are the poor in spirit. When you're at the end of your rope and you have nowhere else to go and you have no idea what to do and you don't know what your next step is, hey, you're blessed. Blessed are those who mourn. When you just lost something that's important to you, when you maybe just lost something that is the most important thing in the world to you, I just want you to know you're blessed. And I had to imagine at this time, people might have been scratching their heads just a little bit, but hey, it's Jesus. We'll give him a chance. Blessed are the meek, maybe the most misunderstood language or word in the Bible in some ways. Blessed are the meek. When you have to swallow your pride, when you have the strength and the ability to lash out and you decide not to, or you are forced not to, when you have to have humility, or worse, when humility is forced upon you, you're blessed. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Blessed are those who are merciful. Blessed are the pure of heart. Blessed are the peacemakers. In a world that had no place for peace, a world where might made right, the biggest army was the winner. That was the person in charge. That was the person who got to make the rules. Blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are those who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness. So imagine that with me for just a moment. Because being able to barely hang on, being there just holding on by your fingernails, mourning because things are taken away from you, being meek because Roman soldiers were allowed to come up and strike you whenever they felt like it, just if they could elicit a response. When they were allowed to come up and take your coat from you just because they liked your coat. When they were allowed to come up and hand you their pack that some historians say were 30, 40, 50, maybe 100 pounds and say, carry this for the next mile for me. When humility was forced upon you by the law, when everything else on that list had no value in that world, Jesus told that crowd, you're blessed because of those things. And now we're getting to the part that really struck to me and really started to shape and change my relationship with God and change really how I look at this world. And it's the part that had to blow their minds because they're already scratching their heads trying to figure out, how do these things make us blessed? These are just day-to-day life for us. And he said, you are the salt of the earth. And I'm reading here from verse 13 now. But if salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it underneath a bowl. Instead, they put it on a stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. To which point I can only imagine the crowd would have been like, what? What is going on here? Salt? How can you say that? Because what is just table salt to us was life to the ancient world. A Roman senator once said, mankind can live without gold, but not without salt. Historically, few things are as significant as salt. Entire cities were built because they were close to salt deposits. Roads were built. Roads that still exist today, trade routes that still exist today, were built because it connected two areas of salt. Wars were fought over salt. Entire economies were based on salt. As a matter of fact, salt itself was a currency. Roman soldiers were often paid in salt, and the word salary comes from the word salarium in Latin, which means salt money. And soldier comes from the word solarium, which is soldier's pay. So that leads us pretty easily to understanding now to be not worth your salt means you're not worth whatever I pay you. And salt in Jewish culture was no less. In fact, it was probably more important. First of all, the Jews were forbidden. It's in Leviticus, it's in the law. They were forbidden to eat blood because the Old Testament tells us life is in the blood. Do not eat blood. And they figured out very quickly we can put salt on things, and one of its properties is it draws moisture and it draws the blood out of food. There were very specific rules in the Jewish culture of exactly how much salt to put on meat, how thickly to put it on, and how long to leave it on there so it would pull that out. It was essential to their religion. In Leviticus, it also tells them, do not offer a grain offering to me, do not offer a grain offering to God without salting it first. There were salt covenants at the time, or I should say in the Old Testament. Two of the most important covenants with God to the Jewish people were called salt covenants. One, the covenant between Aaron and his sons, and the Aaron line of priests, the Levite line of priests, God says, the Old Testament tells us, is a salt covenant. And the other between David, King David, and his descendants, and that covenant between them and God for the kingship of Israel, the Bible tells us, was a salt covenant. So, no doubt, when it comes to religion and spirituality and community, salt economy, salt was important. But maybe even more so just in the day-to-day life, salt was important to Jewish people because it had preservative qualities. Well before refrigerators, you could salt meat and it would last. It wouldn't go bad within hours or days, as you can imagine it would now. And quite frankly, it just made things taste better. So salt preserves what they need for day-to-day life, and salt makes things taste better. And it does, doesn't it? Right? My kids tease me about this story. I'm going to share it with you for the first time. My daughter's back there probably rolling her eyes, although no daughter should do that to her father. It really does, you guys. It borders on mocking the treatment I get at the dinner table when we have sweet corn, specifically corn on the cob. Now, I mentioned I'm from Iowa, so I know what good sweet corn is. And up until about 5th grade, I always just covered my sweet corn with butter. And that's pretty good, right? You get good sweet corn, which occasionally in Wyoming we get good sweet corn. In Iowa, you could just swing a stick and get good sweet corn. And I covered it with butter. And then some friends took us to the Iowa Sweet Corn Festival. It's a real thing. I'm sure they laugh at rodeo. And all the sweet corn you could eat was free. And they would dip it in these gigantic, is not a healthy fare, gigantic vats of melted butter and lots of salt. And in 5th grade, I was like, well, okay, it's not normally how I eat it, but I'll try it. And I took a bite, and it changed my life. I do not eat corn on the cob